Thanks so much for joining me on this Slice of Healthcare podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Jared?
Doing well. I'm excited for us to chat. I know you went through. It's been an eventful time out in your part of Texas. So I'm glad we were finally able to connect and have you on. I'd love to really just dive right into it. If you could start by telling our audience a little bit about you, and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Quick note on Texas. It turns out if you're running a tech company, you kind of need electricity. So, go reach out to a friend in Texas at some point this week. So I'm Dr. Tatiana Fofanova. I'm a recovering clinical scientist, I like to say, a writer and a death doula. And I'm part of the founding team of Koda. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Koda. And our story is actually quite unique because my team and I were actually recruited by the Texas Medical Center to identify and address their most critical healthcare needs. It's a really interesting sort of approach. Basically, all the hospitals in the medical center got together, gave us an all-access badge and an all-access pair of scrubs, and told us to go forth and prosper, go into any emergency room, any clinic, whatever you want, to solve their biggest problems in geriatrics, particularly. And throughout this whole process, I found myself in the cancer ward of a hospital here in Houston, where I met a woman who'd been in and out of cancer treatment for over 26 years. And as you might imagine, she was in a lot of pain. She was very tired, and honestly, she was just by every respect ready to go. And she was begging to speak to really anybody about her healthcare options for her end-of-life healthcare planning. But nobody was really willing to listen. The doctors thought it was morose. Her husband didn't want to hear anything about it. And sadly, this is when most people first start this conversation, which to me and my team was really baffling, right? Because research shows that engaging in conversations about healthcare, and that type of healthcare particularly early on, reduces family stress and actually improves outcomes and increases the length and the quality of our patients' lives. But unfortunately, we don't talk to our patients early. We spent 6 months in all of these clinical sites, and we found that a grand total of 0 physicians or nurse practitioners or any sort of provider brought it up. But when you're treating an elderly patient, the eventuality of passing away is really the elephant in the room. And it's just something that is very awkward for a lot of physicians to engage in. And so as a result, the patient's only real recourse is to basically figure it out on their own, and usually on their own dime. And we just thought this was a travesty, quite frankly, particularly because direct-to-consumer solutions in traditional ways of planning for your future healthcare, like estate planning attorneys, are really only available to affluent populations. And the vast majority of people on Medicare are at or below the poverty line. And so they don't have that. And as a result, the only sort of recourse they have is to just talk to their family. But without any clinical guidance, those conversations are not as fruitful. And without documentation in place, those choices are often not chronicled or followed. And so patients get the delivery of care that doesn't actually align with their interests or goals or needs or desires, which is, of course, devastating to families, but also extremely expensive for health systems that spend over $100 billion every year delivering care people don't even want.
Interesting. Now, when Texas Medical Center brought you in and you got to really kind of look at all these different issues, right? And when you settled in on this one, what was their thought process? Like, how were they supportive to you and your team in taking the next step from there?
Yeah. So the Texas Medical Center brought people from the clinical side in to solve a clinical problem. A lot of the solutions that are in place talk about, document sharing and, let's get someone to sign this and then we'll put it in our records. But they realized that To really solve this issue, you had to bring in somebody who is familiar with the culture of physicians, right? Physicians are not likely to dig through an electronic medical record when somebody lands in the emergency room. They're likely to turn to the next of kin, right? And the next of kin, if that's the first time they're seeing a document, they're not obliged to follow it. They can just ignore it entirely. And so they were facing this problem. And so what these hospitals and health systems did for us is they provided us funding to explore the problem adequately without the pressure of building a solution immediately. So we had 6 months of dedicated customer discovery before we could ever write a line of code. We had the opportunity to have hundreds of end-of-life conversations with patients and physicians before we even incorporated. We were able to test our MVP in a variety of clinical sites across Houston at different stages of severity in terms of primary care versus geriatrics versus ER and trauma and all sorts of things. So this was already top of mind for a lot of health systems, partially because of this massive transition to value-based care that we're seeing. But this really became one of their top priorities when the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, they had no time or capability to have these conversations with their patients, and also found themselves seeing a shortage of equipment like ventilators. And all of a sudden, all of these physicians were forced to make decisions about who got a ventilator and who didn't, and thought, man, wouldn't it have been nice if we had just asked them first?
So you basically were able to, now correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you were able to incorporate you were working on this before December 2019, but is that when you actually incorporated the business formally?
So we started working on this in August of 2019. And like I said, we had this 6-month sandbox to really figure out truly what is going on, like what's wrong with the problem, why are existing solutions not working, why are things not being adopted. We went full-time into our solution in January and incorporated in March, effectively right before the announcement of the pandemic. I think we filed our incorporation paperwork 2 weeks before lockdown in Texas. And from that point on, it just really skyrocketed, right? Because our solution is a low labor digital solution to facilitate healthcare planning, advanced healthcare planning for seniors. It is built with seniors in mind specifically, which are, of course, the most at-risk population in this year pandemic. And it allows physicians to engage in this conversation without the training that a palliative care physician might need or have, for example.
What's your ideal, I guess, customer that you like to go to at this stage of the game?
So we're very passionate about providing care and access to healthcare planning to everyone, right? The fact of the matter is that when people are responsible for the care that they deliver, financially responsible for the care that they deliver, they are more aligned and more likely to actually push solutions that allow physicians to deliver care that matters to patients. So for example, when you have discussions about healthcare options or end-of-life healthcare planning with most seniors, depending on age group and their value sets, most of them will prefer comfort care. 80% of patients prefer to die at home, but because of this miscommunication, 60% will die in a healthcare facility. And I've seen it myself. It's terrible when you see a 94-year-old lady that you spoke to last week that just wants to be home alone with her family and her cats, have her chest ripped open in a hospital in front of her grandkids, right? It's very traumatic. And so for that reason, our best customer or our best approach is health systems that are financially responsible for the care they provide. So any risk-bearing system. That said, we do work with primary care physicians as well, and fee-for-service clinics, because this is a reimbursable conversation, a reimbursable event that is usually just a little bit too awkward or too much of a lift for physicians to engage in to drop that code. But by going through the majority of the conversation ourselves and handling all the documentation, we make it a little easier, which also benefits us, right? Because the earlier it's introduced, the better it is for the patient.
Makes sense. Interesting. Okay. So what are some of the things that you're most looking forward to as, we're already a couple months into 2021 now, right? After a crazy 2020. What are some of the things you're looking forward to, I guess, in regards to the business?
In regards to the business, we have a number of, pilot sites where we're able to work with partners that really align with our mission and are pushing for innovation. One thing that I will attribute to the pandemic, actually two things I will attribute to the pandemic, is that there is a new appetite for innovation, because on the stress of a pandemic, a lot of systems have broken, or we've realized that they were broken from the beginning, right? And so there's this hunger for improving things and this window of opportunity of, in some sense, post-traumatic growth, where we can switch things up and implement some solutions that actually work. And the second thing I will attribute to the pandemic is that it's really changed the narrative about end-of-life healthcare and healthcare planning overall. So it is really shone a light on the issues that patients face and the issues that physicians face, and the financial consequences of not providing this to all of our patients, right? And so it's my hope that we can use this cultural shift to ideally, in 10, 15 years, make this a commonplace conversation. This is not a problem that I want to be solving, for lack of a better phrase, right? I don't want that for myself or for my family or for any of the patients we work with. And at the end of the day, ideally, we build something that I can use with my own grandma, honestly.
I like that. Well, as we discussed a little before the podcast started too, like, this is really your and in your company's intro podcast, right? The goal is to have you and maybe other members of your team on again and on the show, and be able to do some different segments where we kind of go into, we did a broad overview of the company and your background today, but talk about some more issues. So I look forward to that. And I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast. It means a lot.
Thanks so much, Jared. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.